The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful, but they're also ancient, quiet, and full of places no one goes anymore. What you're about to hear isn't loud or full of jump scares. These are slow, creeping, true horror stories. Real people, real forests, and things that never fully explain themselves. Stay with me till the end, and if you love real horror, don't forget to subscribe to Creepy Souls. I wasn't supposed to hike that far. None of us were. It was just me, my cousin Dan, and our friend Taylor. We'd driven out past Harlan, deeper into the ridges than usual, following a looped trail we'd found on an old topo map. We thought we'd be back before dark, but the forest swallowed the trail markers quicker than we realized. By the time we noticed, the path had narrowed into nothing but wet undergrowth and the hushed sound of cicadas rising from the hollows. We decided to keep going, telling ourselves we'd cut back across and find the trail again. That's when we found the creek bed. It was wide but dry, littered with smooth stones, the dirt pressed down like something had dragged along it. The ground nearby was flat enough to pitch tents. It wasn't scenic, but it was better than fumbling around in the dark. We set up just before the last light drained from the ridge. The air smelled of wet leaves and iron-rich soil. No birds, no distant road noise, just silence pressing in so heavy, you heard your own pulse. We ate in near quiet, every snap of a twig pulling our heads up. By midnight, I was still awake. The tent fabric amplified every sound, the creak of trees, the shifting of dirt under my sleeping bag. Then came the steps. At first, I thought it was Dan getting up to piss. The crunch was slow, deliberate. Leaves, twigs. But then they circled. The sound moved behind my tent, then off toward Taylor's, then back again. "Dan," I whispered. The steps stopped. Taylor's muffled voice came. "That you?" Silence. The kind that makes the inside of your throat go dry. Then, after a long pause, the steps picked up again. Closer this time, circling like whoever it was wanted us to know. No flashlight beam cut through the fabric, no human voice. Just footsteps. Always stopping dead when one of us spoke. I pressed my knife flat against my chest, listening to the slow, deliberate pacing outside. I didn't sleep. None of us did. We waited until the first smear of light broke through the canopy. When we crawled out, the ground told the story. Bare footprints. Wide, narrow, small, large, stamped deep into the mud around our tents. Dozens of them, too many to count, all circling, overlapping, scattered like they'd been dancing around us in the dark. And not one set walked away. We didn't pack breakfast. We just shoved everything into our packs with shaking hands and headed uphill, hoping we'd intersect the trail. No one wanted to mention the prints. It was easier to pretend they weren't real, just smudges in the dirt we misread, but they were too clean, too fresh, too human. The forest grew thicker the farther we went. Saplings clung to our clothes. The creek bed narrowed until it disappeared into bramble. My boots slipped in the mud, but none of us slowed down. Around mid-morning, we reached a clearing where someone had built a fire pit out of flat stones. Not fresh. Ash was cold, scattered, but the arrangement was careful. Around it, tree branches had been leaned into a teepee shape, bark stripped away. Inside the hollow of the teepee, bones, small ones, animal maybe, hung on string. Taylor cursed under his breath. Dan just muttered, "Keep walking." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But the feeling of being watched pressed in like fog. My skin prickled as if someone was standing right behind me. Every time the wind shifted, it carried the faint smell of rot, like damp wood gone sour. We pushed on, moving faster, barely speaking. By late afternoon, we stumbled back onto the marked trail. The relief was sharp, almost dizzying. We half-jogged until we reached the gravel pull-off where our car sat waiting. Even in the car, with doors locked and asphalt under our tires, I kept looking back through the trees, expecting to see someone barefoot and still, standing at the edge of the woods. I told myself I'd forget it, that the prints were some trick of light, that the circling was just an animal. But weeks later, I woke up one morning to find mud smeared across my apartment balcony. Mud that looked like a heel print, fading into the concrete. And sometimes, lying awake at night, I swear I hear it again. Slow steps circling, careful not to be seen, stopping whenever I breathed too loud. It's been months since that night near the creek bed, but I can't unhear it. I can't unsee those prints. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even like windows open at night. Because it wasn't just the footsteps. It was the silence that followed. The deliberate way they stopped, like whoever it was wanted us to know that they were listening. I wasn't new to the mountains. My uncle had raised me on long hikes and cold mornings in the Appalachians, teaching me to respect the ridges and never underestimate the weather. But that trip in late October was different. It was supposed to be a quick weekend escape. Me, my college friend Chris, and his older brother Mark. 3 of us, 1 tent, a fire, and nothing else. We'd parked near an old service road outside of Pineville, then cut into the woods with packs that felt heavier than they should have. The leaves had already gone brown and slick, and the air smelled of rain even though the sky held back. By the time we found a clearing, the fog had begun to settle low, weaving itself between tree trunks like smoke. We made camp near a rotting log, just wide enough to sit 3 across. The place felt quiet. Too quiet. No owls, no distant road noise, just the occasional drip of water off branches. I remember joking about it, but none of us laughed for long. By the time we got the fire burning, the fog had thickened until our world shrank to a circle of orange light. The trees pressed in close and shadows stretched like they wanted to leave the fire behind. We ate, barely talking, and when the fire burned low, we crawled into the tent. I must have been asleep an hour when I heard it, a sharp, clean snap, not like a falling branch, but like weight pressing down on something dry. My eyes opened in the pitch dark, tent fabric shifting slightly with the breeze. Chris was already sitting up, rigid. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Then I saw where he was pointing. Through the mesh flap beyond the dying embers, the tree line looked blurred in fog, but there, fixed between 2 pale trunks, was a shape. Upright. Still. Too tall to be brush. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw breath. We waited. The fire gave just enough light to outline it. A person, standing. No flashlight. No movement, no sound, just there. Mark stirred awake, muttered a curse, then froze once he saw. The 3 of us whispered in fragments. "Who is that? What do they want? Should we call out?" My throat felt like sandpaper, but Chris finally did. "Hey." No. Answer. The shape didn't move, didn't flinch. Just stood there, blending with the mist. I told myself it was another hiker, maybe lost. But hikers carried lights. They shifted weight. Coughed. Scratched. Did something. This one didn't. Minutes dragged. Our breaths fogged the tent fabric. The figure never stepped closer, never retreated, just watched. An hour must have passed that way. My legs cramped. My ears rang with silence. Then, as if a thread had snapped, the shape leaned slightly, barely perceptible, and slipped backward into the dark. No sound of steps, no breaking, brush. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. The 3 of us sat until dawn, waiting for it to come back. It never did. But when I finally unzipped the tent in the morning, the fog was gone, the forest wet with dew, and pressed into the mud just beyond the fire pit were footprints. Bare, wide, pointed straight at us. We didn't talk much while we packed. Mark moved fast, shoving gear like he couldn't stand to touch it. Chris kept glancing at the tree line. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see someone standing there again. We told ourselves we'd finish the loop trail and head home. No more campfire, no second night, just out. But the mountains had other plans. The ridge paths twisted and the fog returned heavier than before. Every landmark blurred until it felt like we were walking in circles. Around noon, drizzle set in. Cold seeped through my jacket, carrying the earthy smell of rot and wet leaves. We came across an old cabin not marked on the map. One wall sagged. The roof had partially collapsed, but it was shelter. We agreed to stop just until the rain lightened. Inside, the air reeked of mold and wet wood. Floorboards bowed under weight, and raccoon scat littered one corner. But what struck me most were the objects left behind. Rusted lanterns, a torn flannel shirt, a metal cot frame with springs bent. On the mantel above a cracked fireplace sat a photograph in a warped frame. The picture showed a family. Father, mother, 2 children. Their faces were water-stained, the details bled out, but the outlines were there. What unnerved me wasn't the photo itself, but how recent the dust seemed disturbed, like someone had touched it not long ago. We didn't linger. The rain eased and we pressed on. But the feeling followed, that we weren't alone, that eyes were on us just out of sight. By dusk, we still hadn't found the trail. The fog swallowed distance, ridges melted into one another. Every branch snap made my pulse race. Mark swore he saw movement ahead, but nothing was there when we looked. That night, with no choice, we set camp again in a hollow. We didn't light a fire. The silence pressed so tight you could hear your own heartbeat. I lay awake, knife in, hand, listening, and then I heard it again. Not a branch this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, patting the wet ground just beyond the tent. A circle. I couldn't breathe. My hand shook so badly the knife rattled against my chest. Chris whispered, "Do you hear it?" And immediately the steps stopped. Dead still, we didn't sleep, not a second. By morning, whoever or whatever had been there was gone. But in the mud, the prints returned. Dozens of them, bare, surrounding the tent like we'd been penned in. We made it out that afternoon, stumbling back to the car half delirious with exhaustion. We never spoke about it after. But here's the part I can't shake. Weeks later, back home, I woke to that same sound outside my window. A soft, steady pacing on the gravel below. I pulled the curtain back. Nothing. Just dark street, no one there. But in the morning, faint in the dirt beside my stoop, I saw them, bare footprints, pointed straight at my door. I grew up a few hours from the mountains, close enough that weekends sometimes meant a tank of gas, a cheap motel, and a trailhead. I'm not a hardcore backpacker, more of a carry too much food and complain about my knees guy, but the Appalachians always reset me. This trip was supposed to be simple. Me, my buddy Eli, and his sister Brooke taking a 2-night loop outside of Harlan. It was late September, cool and damp, the kind of air that felt clean when you breathed it. We left the car near an old service road, crossed a shallow creek, and followed orange blazes that faded into rhododendron and laurel. We joked about bears, traded snacks, kept an eye on the clouds. Normal. The ground was slick with leaf mulch, and the smell of wet wood and crushed fern followed us everywhere. By late afternoon, we found a clearing, flat enough for 2 tents, ringed by tall poplar and hemlock. In the center was a fire pit made of old stones, blackened and collapsed on one side. A couple rusted cans were half buried in the duff nearby, and a circle of log rounds sat like stools. It looked abandoned, like a place people used years back and stopped returning to. We shrugged at the mess, kicked the pit back into shape, and did camp chores without thinking. Water filter at the creek. Food hang line up in a crooked tulip poplar. Tarps strung low because the sky had that heavy gray look. Eli went looking for downed limbs. Brooke and I sorted through my ridiculous food bag and tried to count how many packets of instant oatmeal I'd packed by accident. It was all comfortable muscle memory, the little rituals you do to make wild places feel like somebody's porch. We ate early because it got dim fast under the canopy. There's a specific kind of quiet the mountains get at dusk in the fall. No cicadas, just the occasional elk bugle far off, a whippoorwill who sounds like it's complaining, and the steady drip of moisture off leaves. We kept the fire small, mostly coals, and watched the fog slide into the low parts of the clearing and settle like a thin blanket. The pit didn't look special, not then. Just a circle of rocks and our small glow. When the drizzle started, we let the coals go dull and crawled into the tents around 9. Eli made a joke about how every horror story starts with, "We found a clearing someone else used," and we laughed because that's what you do before sleep. Turn danger into a punchline and call it preparation. Sometime after midnight I woke, to a smell I knew too well. Not the fading damp smell of extinguished coals, but living smoke. The kind that crawls into your hair and clings to your jacket. For a second I thought I was dreaming, because the rain on the fly was soft, regular, and the air inside my bag was warm. Then I heard Brooke shift, a zipper whisper, and Eli's silhouette sitting up. I pushed the flap and looked out. The fire pit was burning, not a random flare from a stubborn coal. This was a neat, deliberate stack, cribbed like a log cabin with a small, bright core. The wood was fresh split. You could see the pale, wet hearts of the pieces glistening where the wedge had opened. Them. The flame wasn't greedy. It was measured like someone who knew how to build heat without smoke. The woods around us were absolutely quiet. No footfalls, no twig snaps, nothing but rain tapping the tent and that slow, steady flame sound you feel more than hear. None of us had lit it. I whispered, "Eli?" Because it felt less insane to accuse someone I loved of a prank than to accept the other options. He shook his head without taking his eyes off the pit. Brooke didn't say anything. She had the same stiff posture people get when a dog bristles at something you can't see. The clearing felt smaller than before, like the trees had leaned in a foot while we slept. I waited for a flashlight beam, a cough, human clutter, anything, and got nothing. It was like a stage had been set for us, and whoever set it stepped into the wings and held their breath. We slid into our boots and unzipped slowly. Rain made the mud shine. We didn't walk all the way to the pit. We stood just at the edge of our tents, shoulders almost touching. The stack was tidy. That was what kept bothering me. Whoever did it used small kindling at the center and ringed it with split pieces all roughly the same length. The ends flashed white in the flame, and there was a sweet sap smell under the smoke. None of that wood had been there before. Eli had dragged over punky limbs hours ago, and we'd burned what little was dry. These pieces were clean and new, as if someone had been splitting round somewhere just out of earshot. "Hello?" Eli called. His voice sounded wrong, swallowed by fog and rain. Nothing answered. The fire didn't even flick back. The silence behind the flames felt heavy, like a full room you couldn't see. I thought about stepping closer, kicking the stack apart, but some part of my brain that still listens to my uncle's old rules flared up. You don't antagonize what you don't understand in the dark. So we stood there like that for a long time, watching wood become coal. We took turns staying awake, not because we decided to, just because none of us could keep our eyes closed more than a few minutes. The flame dropped to a soft red oval, then to a black mouth. Rain steamed. I kept waiting for a shape to detach from the trees and cross the clearing. Nothing did. That should have made it less frightening. It didn't. The fear was in the absence, in the way the air tasted like smoke again when it had no reason to. At first light, everything looked ordinary in the way scenes do after a nightmare. Wet leaves, our rope line sagging with water weight. The same stones we'd kicked back into place. The pit was cool enough to touch. I squatted and poked the ash gently. There were three things that made my mouth go dry. The first was how clean the burn had been. No charred ends, no unspent chunks. Somebody who understood fire had tended it. The second was the wood itself. I could see bright slivers where bark had been shaved, curls fallen into the ash like pale fish scales. A short length of twine lay nearby, dark with rain, cut clean. We hadn't brought twine. The third thing was our hatchet. Eli had left it under the tarp. Now it stood blade down in the mud beside the pit, the edge newly honed, a tiny burr taken out near the heel. Somebody had sharpened our tool and left it there like a courtesy. We didn't say the word leave. We just said things like, "Pack light and we'll eat on the trail." Brooke moved faster than I've ever seen her move in the morning. I kept looking at the tree line and seeing nothing, which was somehow worse than seeing something. As we shouldered our packs, I noticed a small, tidy stack of kindling, 6 pencil-thin sticks, deliberately arranged under the log round I'd sat on the night before. I nudged it with my boot and the whole thing toppled in one piece like it had been glued with sap. We cut back toward the creek instead of continuing the loop. The sky came down a little farther, and the world turned to wet gray. Rhododendron. Thickets closed in so tight we had to angle our packs and push with our shoulders. Every noise felt like it belonged to us. Even the river sounds were dampened like the water was moving with its mouth closed. A mile later, in a muddy stretch, we found prints. Not clear heel-to-toe impressions, just shallow ovals where someone had stepped barefoot and the water pulled around the edges. There were too many to count, and none of them went cleanly in or out. They wandered like a deer trail, then vanished into a mat of leaves. We kept moving. Around midday, we hit an old logging road and followed it, just grateful for straight lines. The road bent around a low hill and we came to another clearing, small, hidden. There was a second pit there, cold. The stones were arranged in a perfect ring, and in the center someone had built a little structure, a tiny, careful crib made of quartered splits. It wasn't lit. It was ready. Eli glanced at me without moving his head. We didn't stop. We didn't run either. We just passed through as if the clearing were a room in someone else's house. By late afternoon, we reached the car. I know how this next part sounds. I'm telling it anyway because I don't know how to remove it and keep the truth. On the hood of the Subaru, just above the grill, someone had left a pyramid of kindling, bound with the same dark twine I'd seen by the pit. Rain slicked the wood so it looked varnished. I picked it up because I couldn't not, because I needed the evidence to be something my hands could hold. The knot was a clove hitch with a half-hitch finish, the exact way my uncle used to tie bundles for his wood stove. That detail bothered me more than anything, the competence, the quiet courtesy of it. We drove straight to the small sheriff's office off the highway and told the deputy everything, leaving out nothing, including how carefully the fire had been built and how sharpened our hatchet was. He listened, the way people do when they've heard a version before. He said there were folks who lived back in there, some temporarily, some because they'd always done it. He said, "They don't want trouble, they just want you gone," and told us next time to camp closer to marked sites. He took the twine bundle, looked at it, handed it back. It felt like we'd brought in a weather report. Nobody had done anything illegal that he could point at. I thought the whole thing might fade. Things usually do. Back home, the smoke stayed in my fleece no matter how many times I washed it, but that's just fabric. I slept fine for a week. Then I started waking around 2 or 3 in the morning with a feeling I couldn't name, like I'd missed a step on a dark stair. No sound, just silence so complete I could hear my apartment settle. One night, standing at the kitchen window, I caught the clean, sweet smell of sap from fresh split wood. It went as fast as it came, like someone walked by with it cupped in their hands. I don't tell this part often. On a rainy Saturday in October, about a month after the trip, I found a bundle leaning against my back door. 6 pencil-thin sticks, bound with dark twine. The knot was neat, familiar. I told myself it was a weird porch prank, maybe a neighbor's kid playing pioneer. I tossed it in the trash and felt ridiculous. That night, I kept thinking about the way the stack fell in one piece when I nudged it at the clearing, like it wanted to burn together. We didn't go back to that loop. I haven't slept in a tent since. Maybe it was nothing more than someone asserting space the way people do when they've been pushed to the edges, quietly, efficiently, without a word. Maybe it was a warning so gentle it felt polite. Either way the message landed. Every now and then, when the wind drops out and the neighborhood goes still, I catch a hint of smoke that isn't there and feel the old fear bloom. Fires don't build themselves. Someone lit ours, tended it, and slipped away without making a sound. They didn't steal, they didn't break, they didn't speak. They just made sure we understood whose clearing it was. They never caught anyone, and maybe there was never anyone to catch. But when I think about that perfect stack glowing in the rain, it doesn't feel like a threat so much as an invitation written in heat. Leave now, before the rest of the woodpile is ready. I left. I'm still leaving. And when the night goes, very, very quiet, I can almost hear kindling touch kindling. A careful hand turning a stick just so, getting the flame right for whoever wanders in next. I hadn't been out in the mountains in over a year. Life got in the way. Work, relationships, the usual noise. But when Jake texted me out of nowhere asking if I wanted to do a long weekend loop through Laurel Ridge, I said yes before thinking it through. We used to hike a lot after college, nothing hardcore, just remote enough to feel alone. Jake had a new tent, I had new boots I hadn't broken in, and the weather looked decent. So we packed light, left early Friday, and drove into southeastern Kentucky until pavement turned to gravel. The trailhead was barely marked, just a rusted post and some paint faded to white. We parked the truck on a pull-off that looked like it hadn't seen another vehicle in weeks. The forest was already thick, late fall, damp leaves underfoot, everything quiet except for the occasional bird call or the snap of branches above, from squirrels. The smell was rich. Wet earth, decaying leaves, that cool Appalachian moss that clings to everything. The first day was long but uneventful. We followed the ridge trail for a few miles, stopping at a rocky outcrop with a view over a misty valley. It was beautiful, in that way the mountains can be when you feel far from people. No cell signal, no road sounds, just the wind and our own footsteps. We found a clearing tucked just off the trail and set up camp. A fire pit was already there, ringed with stone and full of cold ash. We did all the usual backcountry stuff, got water from the stream, hung our food bags on a bear, lined between two trees, ate freeze-dried chili. That night the woods were quiet. I mean dead quiet. Even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes it's like that out there, still and heavy. Jake fell asleep fast. I lay awake a little longer, just listening. But nothing moved. No animals, no wind, no insects. Just stillness. The next morning, everything seemed fine. We made coffee, broke down camp, and headed deeper along the loop trail. The terrain dipped into a hollow, wet, shaded, full of that kind of rotten bark smell you only get where the sun never fully dries the ground. We passed an old logging road, barely visible now under decades of growth. Jake joked about detouring to look for moonshine stills. I laughed but kept walking. Something about that old road felt off, forgotten. That night we camped near a dry creek bed. No fire pit this time, just a patch of cleared ground beside a huge fallen tree. We strung the bear line again, tying our food up out of reach, and settled in early. No fire, too damp. We sat in the dark, listening to the slow drip of water from the trees, the occasional distant owl. Around midnight, I woke up needing to piss. As I stepped out of the tent, something felt wrong. I couldn't place it at first. The night air was cold, the forest quiet, but not still. There was a faint movement, like something had just slipped out of view. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just branches swaying slightly like they'd been touched. I didn't wake Jake. I zipped back in and tried to sleep. In the morning, Jake was standing near the bear line, frowning. "Dude," he said, "did you move this?" 2 of our 3 food bags were still hanging. The third was on the ground, unzipped but not ripped or torn. It looked intentional. Whoever or whatever took it had set it neatly beside the tent, almost like a gift. Or a message. We checked the contents. Some stuff was missing. An energy bar, a bag of trail mix, jerky. But most of it was still there. No bite marks, no scratches, just gone. Jake laughed it off, said maybe raccoons figured out zippers. But I've seen raccoon bags. They tear, scatter, leave trash everywhere. This wasn't that. This was clean. We rehung everything and moved on. But the whole day I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. The third night we pushed farther than planned, just to feel like we were putting distance between us and whatever happened near that creek. I didn't say it out loud, but Jake must have felt it too. We hiked past the old service marker and deeper into a section of trail barely used. Overgrown switchbacks, trees bent low with moss. A stretch of fallen logs too large to climb without, shedding your pack. Eventually we found a ridge ledge wide enough to camp on. One side dropped into a ravine, the other was a slope full of birch and pine. We pitched the tent tight to the drop-off. It didn't feel smart to camp there, but it felt safer than being surrounded on all sides. That night, we didn't eat. Just filtered water and sat silently, listening. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a thump. Not loud, but deliberate, close enough to shake the thin nylon wall of the tent. I held my breath, waiting. There was a sound, soft, almost like something brushing the tent fabric. Jake whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Neither of us moved. Eventually, the sound stopped. At dawn, the food line was down. Not snapped or slashed, lowered. The knots were intact, but the bags had been lowered to the ground like someone knew what they were doing. 2 bags were untouched. The third one, mine again, was opened. The contents were laid out in a neat row. Instant coffee, trail bar, jerky, spoon, not stolen. Arranged, and beside it, sitting on the cold ground, was one of my socks. Clean. Folded. That's when something cracked inside me. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't even theft. It felt like someone watching. Someone who wanted us to know they were close, capable, that they could take anything from us at any time but chose not to. We packed fast. Didn't eat. Didn't speak much. Just stuffed gear and pushed hard back toward the trailhead. The forest didn't look the same. The trees felt closer. The shadows darker. I kept imagining footsteps just behind us, always out of sync with our own. We reached the truck in record time, scraped with briars, out of breath. When we opened the tailgate, my stomach dropped. Inside the bed of the truck, placed dead center on the rubber mat, was the same bag of trail mix that had gone missing on the second night, still sealed, still full. Neither of us said a word. We drove, the whole way home in silence. I haven't been back since. Jake and I haven't spoken much either. Not because we're mad, but because there's something neither of us want to admit out loud. That we weren't alone out there, and whoever was in those woods with us wasn't looking to hurt us. They were just watching, waiting, making sure we knew, and maybe next time, they wouldn't be so polite. I'd camped a dozen times in the Appalachians, but that weekend felt different before we even got to the trailhead. The air had that heaviness that presses into your chest, like a storm that never arrives. It was supposed to be an easy overnight. Just me, Ryan, and Eli, college friends, all overdue for a break. We picked a lesser-known loop south of Norton, Virginia, where the map showed old logging paths cutting across hollows and ridgelines. The trails weren't maintained anymore, but we figured we could handle it. The first few miles were overgrown, but manageable. The woods were thick with pine and black birch, the ground soft and springy beneath the leaves. Moss-covered stone walls popped up every now and then, remnants of whatever used to be settled out here. The fog rolled in by late afternoon, turning the trail into a muted tunnel. The quiet was almost too complete. We found a flat spot just off, a narrow ridge not far from where an old trail split east and disappeared into underbrush. You could barely tell it had once been a path, just a faint depression in the ground like a scar the forest hadn't fully healed. Eli pointed at it and joked about witches or bootleggers. We laughed, but none of us camped too close to it. We pitched the tents in a triangle. Mine closest to the trail, Ryan and Eli tucked farther into the trees. Dinner was quiet, freeze-dried meals eaten by the dim orange of our little fire. Fog crept low along the ground, curling between roots and stumps. The smell of damp bark and cold stone soaked into everything. Around 10, the fire started to sputter and the cold set in. We turned in without saying much. The forest felt too still. No crickets, no owls. Just the soft rustle of wet branches. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me. It was subtle, like wind at first, but not random, rhythmic. Voices, low, hushed like someone trying not to be heard, like a group whispering back and forth the way kids do when they're hiding. At first I thought it was Ryan and Eli talking. But when I sat up, the voices were outside, close, and not just one or two. It was hard to tell what they were saying. Muffled syllables, broken by soft laughter or hushes. But they moved, slowly, drifting closer, like they were walking the trail. My heart was pounding. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. The voices got louder, not shouting, just more of them, closer now. Right outside, then they stopped. The air felt thick, like the fog had weight. I couldn't hear anything. No footfalls, no breathing, not even the leaves moving, just dead silence pressing in from every direction. I waited. A minute, maybe more. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. My fingers hovered over the flap, but something about that silence, how total it was, made me freeze. Finally, I took a breath and pulled the zipper. Nothing. Just pale fog creeping through the trees, wet ground glistening in the moonlight. No movement. No people. The old trail looked the same, empty, overgrown, and still. But something had changed. I felt it. The way you know someone's been in your room even if everything looks untouched. I zipped the tent back up and sat with my back against the pack until morning. None of us slept well. Eli looked pale when the sun finally filtered through the trees. He said he'd heard something walking between the tents around 3 a.m. Slow, heavy steps, circling. Ryan hadn't heard anything, but he pointed out something else. Our boot prints around the fire were smudged and overlapped by others. Barefoot, dozens of faint prints in the soft leaf mulch surrounding the campsite. Some were small, childlike, others long and narrow. We tried to reason it out. Maybe we'd misread the tracks, maybe animals, maybe frost heave had distorted them overnight. None of us really believed that, but it made packing up faster. We decided to skip the second night and finish the loop that afternoon. The trail ahead ran parallel to that same overgrown path for a while before climbing out of the hollow. As we hiked, the fog thinned, but the feeling didn't lift. Every bend in the trail felt like it was hiding someone just out of sight. A couple miles in, we passed what looked like the remnants of an old homestead, a collapsed cabin half swallowed by vines. The chimney still stood, but everything else sagged and rotted. We didn't stop, but I noticed something strange about the clearing. Rocks, small piles, carefully stacked in little towers no more than knee-high, lined both sides of the overgrown trail, every 20 or 30 feet, like markers. Some had bits of bone placed in the center. Others had thin twigs tied in loops or small fabric scraps tucked beneath them, all sun-faded and rotted. It looked ritualistic, but not fresh. Old, like something that had been kept up for years and slowly forgotten. Eli muttered, "We shouldn't be here," and no one disagreed. We didn't talk again until we reached a creek and stopped to refill water. That's when Ryan pulled something from the side pocket of his pack, a small piece of wood, carved smooth. The center was hollowed into a tiny spiral, like a whistle, but with no opening. He hadn't packed it. Neither had we. We left it on a rock and kept moving. The trail widened after that, but the silence stayed. Even the birds seemed absent. Near the end of the loop, where the trail met the Forest Service road, we passed another hiker heading in. Older guy, weathered face, heavy pack. He gave a short nod, but his eyes lingered on us a little too long. As he passed, he said something low under his breath. Ryan asked, "What was that?" The man didn't stop, but I heard him clearly. "You heard them too, didn't you?" We didn't answer. Back at the car, there was dirt on the hood, not smeared, written, a line of fingerprints, like someone had pressed their hand, dragged each finger down carefully. 5 long streaks, side by side. That night back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the whispers, not what they said, because I still don't know if they were speaking words. It felt more like sound pretending to be language, like a voice just barely shaped into meaning. Sometimes I still hear it when I'm half asleep or walking past dense trees, and always in a group. Never just one. They never touched us, never showed themselves, but they wanted us to know. That path wasn't forgotten. It was watched. It started as just a weekend thing, something to shake the stress off. I was 2 months deep into a rough patch, breakup, work deadlines piling up, barely sleeping, and my friend Mason suggested a backcountry hike. Old school quiet, he called it. No signal, no trail markers, just map and compass. We'd done that kind of thing in college. It sounded like what I needed. We picked a section of the Appalachians near Breaks Interstate Park, somewhere off the state line where the ridges dipped low into the fog, the kind of place that only old men in camo and loggers on ATVs really knew. Mason had found a route online that cut through old mining paths and forgotten forest roads. It was supposed to offer a full loop around a hollow known as White Ash Valley. We parked where the gravel ended and spent most of the first day hiking uphill through slick, root-choked terrain. The trees were tight up there, mostly pine and dead oak, and the ground gave off this thick smell of moss and cold dirt. Every now and then we'd pass rusted metal, a broken axle, a wheel, collapsed fence posts, things long since swallowed by the woods. Around dusk, we found a ridge with a wide overlook facing east down into a bowl-shaped valley. There wasn't much of a view, too much fog, but the land sloped gently, and the trees opened up enough to see layers of gray folding into each other. It looked untouched. We made camp just behind the rise where the slope flattened. Mason strung the food up and I worked on getting the fire going. The temperature dropped fast, and the woods grew hushed in that way they do when night falls hard, like someone pressed cotton into your ears. No wind, no crickets, just the fire popping and the occasional squeak of our boots against wet leaves. It was after dinner, close to 10 p.m., when I noticed the light. At first, I thought it was a reflection from our fire, but it was too far out, maybe a few hundred yards down the valley just beyond the lower tree line. A warm orange glow, flickering steady. "Hey," I said. "You see that?" Mason turned and squinted. "Campfire," he muttered. "Guess we're not the only ones out here." But that didn't sit right with me. We'd followed a barely there trail all day. Nothing had looked remotely traveled, let alone recently. No tire ruts, no footprints, no wrappers or shell casings. And this other campfire, it was in the middle of dense growth, not in a clearing or off a path. We watched it for a while. No voices, no movement, just the soft rise of light. It didn't flicker like ours. It burned too evenly, like someone was tending it carefully, adding fuel in quiet increments. Then it just dimmed. Not all at once, but gradually, like someone placing a lid over it. Within minutes it was gone, swallowed by the fog. We stared a while longer, then crawled into our tents. Mason joked that they were probably ultralight hikers too quiet for their own good. But I lay awake longer than I wanted to, listening to the dark and wondering if we'd actually seen anything at all. We broke camp at first light. The fire pit was cold, the ground slick with dew. Mason wanted to make breakfast, but I couldn't stop thinking about the light we saw. Something about it had stuck in my head like a splinter. I convinced him to hike down toward the spot. "Just 5 minutes off trail," I said. "Let's just see." It took closer to 20. We followed the slope down past the tree line, through tangles of mountain laurel and damp pine needles. The forest was tight, and the ground leveled into a kind of natural basin ringed by sycamores. It should have been the perfect place to set up a fire, flat, dry, and partially sheltered from the wind. But there was nothing there. No clearing, no disturbed soil, no ashes, no ring of rocks or half-burned wood, not even pressed grass where someone might have pitched a tent. I walked the area twice, then crouched and dug into the dirt with a stick. Still nothing. No smell of smoke. No signs of people. Mason stood nearby, arms crossed. "Maybe it was a reflection," he offered. "Some light bouncing off cloud cover." I didn't answer, because the more I looked around, the more wrong it felt. Not just empty, untouched, like no one had been there for years. We climbed back to the trail in silence. The rest of the day was quiet. Too quiet. The fog never really lifted, and even though it was mid-morning, the The sky stayed dim and colorless. Around noon, we came across what looked like an old boundary marker, a rusted chain strung between two metal posts. No sign, no gate, just the line, disappearing into overgrowth on either side. Past the chain, the woods changed. The trees stood farther apart, and the forest floor was covered in crushed leaves, thick and undisturbed. It smelled different, older. The kind of scent you get in crawl spaces or long abandoned places. Mildew, rot, something sour underneath. We hiked another hour before Mason called for a break. I dropped my pack beside a stump and wandered a bit. Not far, just stretching my legs. That's when I saw the ring of stones, set into a shallow groove in the ground, perfectly circular, blackened on the underside. The rocks were dry, smooth. Someone had built a fire here. Not recently, but not long ago either. There were no footprints, just the ring, and beside it, tucked between two stones, was a strip of fabric. Gray, sun-faded, frayed at the edges. Looked like it could have been from a sleeve. I didn't touch it. When I told Mason, he didn't want to go back. Too many weird things. In the woods, he said. People live off-grid out here, some just don't want to be found. We pushed forward, making camp before dark. I didn't mention the soft crunching I heard just after midnight. Not an animal, too slow, too deliberate, moving through wet leaves like someone barefoot. It stopped when I held my breath. In the morning, I found one of our fuel canisters sitting 5 feet from where I'd placed it, uncapped, not spilled, just moved. When we got back to the car the next afternoon, I felt relief in a way I hadn't expected, like crossing some invisible border. But even now, months later, I think about that valley, about the fire we saw, and how there was no sign it had ever burned. It was Eli's idea. He'd found an old blog post from a hiking forum. Nothing official, just grainy maps and faded descriptions about a ghost loop trail somewhere near Saltville, Virginia. Supposedly abandoned in the 80s after flooding. Washed out one of the bridges. The guy who wrote the post said it cut through a hollow so quiet it felt like being buried alive. Eli was sold, so that's how I ended up in the backwoods of Appalachia on a foggy October afternoon, following barely there blazes with Eli and our friend Marcus, who always brought too much gear and laughed at his own jokes. The three of us had done plenty of trips before, but this one already felt off. Not dangerous, just wrong. Like the woods didn't want us there. The trail was hard to follow. The elevation kept changing, and everything smelled like cold mud and wet moss. Fog clung low to the ground, thick enough that you could hear your boots squelch but not see more than 20 feet ahead. We passed an old game trail with a collapsed blind and found a campsite just beyond that, flat enough for 2 tents, surrounded by tall, rotting poplars. The light was going fast, so we set up without much talking. That's when Marcus spotted the first one, a symbol carved into the bark of a tree just past the fire ring. 3 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal slash like a tally that got interrupted. "Hunters?" he asked. Eli shrugged. "Could be trail signs, or bored kids." We found more as we collected firewood. Different shapes, always shallow but clean, like someone had used a sharp knife and taken their time. One looked like an arrow pointing down, another like a broken circle. I found one behind my tent that just looked like an X with a notch through the center. It didn't feel like vandalism. It felt careful. The fire didn't last long. Everything was too wet and the fog was still pressing in, heavy and cold. We sat around it anyway, eating cold protein bars and trying to ignore the silence around us. I kept expecting the usual night sounds, crickets, an owl, distant rustling, but there was nothing. Just the hiss of damp wood trying to burn and the soft creak of branches in the dark. We turned in early. Eli and Marcus shared a tent. I took mine solo, not that it helped me sleep. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I thought it was wind. Then I heard it again. Tap. Not loud, just once. Like someone knocking softly on wood. Tap, tap. Closer now. Like it had moved. I held my breath. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was circling, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking the perimeter of our sight and gently tapping on the tree trunks as they passed. It wasn't animal movement. It was paced, chosen. I unzipped the inner tent lining, just enough to peek out. Fog had returned, thick as milk, swallowing the space between trees. The fire was out. The woods were dead silent, except for the tapping. It circled again. I could feel the pattern, tree to tree, one tap per trunk, sometimes two. Never fast. Always measured. It didn't stop, not until the first gray light started seeping into the mist. I must have dozed off at some point because Marcus was shaking me awake. His face was pale, and I could tell right away. He'd heard it too. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "Barely," I said. "That tapping." Eli emerged from the other tent looking equally drained. "I thought it was you guys." We didn't eat breakfast, just packed in silence, eyes scanning the tree line. Every trunk seemed to hold something now, some mark we hadn't noticed before. The carvings were everywhere, not just near camp. Farther out, deeper, some high, some low. Always the same types, slashes, circles, notches, and all of them fresh. We debated turning back, but none of us wanted to admit it. So we kept going, hoping the next stretch of trail would feel different. It didn't. By mid-morning, we reached a narrow ridge above a hollow. The sun was trying to break through the cloud cover, but everything stayed dim and colorless. That's when I noticed the trees ahead. They were bare. Dozens of them. No branches. No bark. Just tall gray trunks stretching up like bones. And every single one had the same carving. An X with a notch. Over and over again. Lined like sentries. No animal sounds. No breeze. Just our own breathing. And the soft crunch of boots. In wet leaves. At one point I stepped off trail to pee behind a fallen log. That's when I saw it. A stick propped upright in the dirt with a small stone balanced perfectly on top. Next to it, carved into the tree facing away from the trail, was a symbol I hadn't seen before. Two triangles, one nested inside the way, other. I don't know why, but something about that one made me feel sick. Not just uneasy, physically nauseous. Like I'd swallowed something sharp. I didn't tell the others. That night we made camp early, mostly because none of us had the energy to go farther. The site was rough, sloped, wet, roots poking through the floor, but it was the only place. Remotely clear. I didn't say it, but I noticed a carved symbol just inside the tree line before we set up. I turned my tent so I wouldn't have to look at it. After dark, none of us talked, not even jokes. We sat in silence, sipping water, watching the fog return. I went to bed early, but I didn't expect to sleep. I just wanted to close my eyes, pretend I was somewhere else. Then it started again. Tap. This time it was closer and faster. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence. Then tap, tap, tap. It wasn't circling now. It was approaching, tree to tree, like a path. The pattern tighter, the knock sharper. I held my breath until my lungs burned. My hand closed around the multi-tool in my sleeping bag. Then the tapping stopped. Right outside my tent. I didn't unzip it. I didn't even move. Just sat there frozen in that small nylon bubble, trying not to cry. The silence outside was massive, crushing like the whole forest had gathered around and was listening. It didn't move. It didn't knock again. Just stood there. Or maybe nothing was there at all. I'll never know. By morning, the fog was thick enough we could barely see each other. We packed in record time and left without eating. None of us spoke. Back at the trailhead, something stopped me as I turned to open the truck. A tree, just a few yards off the lot. Normal looking until I saw the mark. The triangle inside the triangle, freshly carved. I still don't know what it meant, but I think whatever it was, followed us out. It was supposed to be the last easy trip before winter. Just one more weekend in the mountains before everything froze solid. I'd been doing solo hikes since I moved to eastern Tennessee a few years back. Something about the stillness in the Appalachian woods, especially late in the season when the trees went bare and the fog rolled in heavy, helped clear out the mental noise. I wasn't running from anything, just trying to breathe a little better. I picked a loop trail near a hollow called Blackroot Gap, about an hour west of Boone. It was steep in places and barely marked, but it promised solitude, which was the point. No other cars at the trailhead. Just gravel, mist, and the slow ticking of my engine cooling down as I shouldered my pack. By early afternoon, I reached a saddle between two ridges and found a flat patch under a row of pine. Someone had camped there before. I saw the remains of a fire ring and a few logs dragged into a semicircle. The ground was soft but dry, carpeted with old needles. The only sound was wind sliding through the branches above, and the faint creak of trees shifting in their age. I pitched my tent, boiled water for a quick meal, and watched the fog roll over the ridge like slow smoke. No birds, no bugs. Just that thick, clean silence. I didn't even listen to music. It felt wrong to break the hush. After sunset, the fire crackled weakly. Most of the wood was damp. I sat beside it until the cold got sharp in my hands, then crawled into my bag. I had a heavy-duty down one I trusted, and I zipped it all the way up to my chin before drifting off. I must have fallen asleep hard. The next thing I remember was shivering. Bad. It was still dark, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, and my shoulders were exposed to the air. The fire had died down to gray ash, and the tent was cold as a cave. I sat up slowly and looked down. The zipper on my bag was halfway open, not ripped, not tugged loose. Unzipped, neatly, carefully. And the pull tab, the little metal piece Cardi was resting on top of the open flap, balanced right in the middle of my chest like someone had placed it there deliberately after opening it. I stared at it for a full minute. My hands felt numb. I tried to convince myself I'd done it, that maybe I rolled over and loosened it myself, but that placement, the way the metal piece rested like it had been arranged, I couldn't explain it. I checked the tent. No rips, no signs of tampering. Everything was exactly where I left it, except the zipper. I stayed up the rest of the night with my knife in my hand, not because I thought it would help, but because not holding it felt worse. The sun broke through just after 6, cold light pushing through fog, washing everything in gray. I packed quickly, didn't even boil coffee. I just needed to be moving. The trail ahead was narrow and washed out in places, with old erosion scars exposing red clay and loose rock. The forest was thick on both sides, filled with that late autumn rot smell, wet leaves, soft wood, the quiet breath of dying things. I kept glancing back. Midway through the loop, I passed what looked like the remains of a structure. Not a cabin, too small. Maybe a storage shed or trapper's lean-to. Just a frame now, roof caved in, beams blackened with age. One wall still stood, leaning sideways with nails poking through like teeth. The ground around it was undisturbed, blanketed, with pine needles and moss. I wasn't planning to stop, but something caught my eye. A scrap of fabric caught on a rusted hinge. I stepped closer. It was the same shade of green as my sleeping bag, same texture, same brand. I checked my pack immediately. The seam on the side pocket, where my bag had been cinched earlier, was torn, as if something had sliced it clean. But there hadn't been anything near my gear. No animals, no people. I would have heard something. I backed away and kept walking. Faster now. By the time I reached the last leg of the trail, the fog returned thick. Everything got muffled. My boots squished in mud, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a dull thump, like wood knocking against something hollow. Once, then again. I stopped, listened. Nothing. 10 minutes later, I reached the ridge that overlooked the trailhead. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was watched. Not directly. Not from a person. More like the forest itself had been holding its breath around me and was only now beginning to exhale. I descended fast and didn't look back. But here's the part I keep coming back to. A week after I got home, I unrolled the sleeping bag to check for damage. I hadn't touched it since. I wanted to convince myself the cold night had just spooked me, that I'd overreacted, but tucked inside the inner lining, near where the zipper ended, I found something. Something I hadn't seen before. A small wooden stick, carved smooth, on one side, the size of a matchbook. And on the flat face, someone had etched a crude line of notches. 4 tall ones, then a gap, then a 5th, like a tally. I didn't put it there. I haven't used that sleeping bag since. And sometimes, when I wake up cold in my apartment, no matter how many blankets I've piled on, I find myself checking the edge of the bed. Not because I hear anything, but because I'm afraid I'll see the zipper pull, resting gently on top, like someone started to open something again and decided to wait. It was Eli's idea to hike the old fire roads through Pinecleft Hollow. He'd been obsessed with forgotten places lately, towns that disappeared, trails erased by time, stories that locals don't want to talk about. We'd camped together a dozen times before, so I agreed, mostly out of habit. I wasn't in the best headspace. I'd just left a job I hated and my sleep had been shot for weeks. I figured a weekend in the woods might help me reset. The first day was quiet. Too quiet. The trail had long since stopped being official. No blazes, no footprints, just an overgrown path that dropped into a long hollow, flanked by bare, black-limbed trees. We walked for hours without seeing another person. Even the birds seemed scarce. That night we pitched camp near a stream, just before the land sloped into denser forest. The water was clean but freezing. Our boots were soaked. Everything smelled like wet moss and bark, the kind of deep Appalachian, damp that never really dries. We sat by the fire, wrapped in jackets, barely speaking. Around midnight, just as I was nodding off in my bag, I heard it. A dog barking. Not a coyote yip. This was a dog. Big sounding. Sharp, spaced out barks, like it was alerting. Maybe 200 yards down the hollow, echoing between the trees. Eli unzipped his tent. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I said. "Stray, maybe." We waited. Listened. The barking went on for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped like someone flipped a switch. Didn't talk about it in the morning. Just packed up and headed deeper. But after an hour, Eli veered off trail. "I want to check something," he said, pointing down the ridge. "See where it was coming from." We followed the slope, skidding, on loose rock and pine needles. The fog hung low and thick. After maybe half a mile, we found it. An old cabin collapsed in the middle. The roof was mostly gone, sunken into itself like a broken jaw. The front porch was still intact, though rotted. A rusted metal chair lay tipped in the weeds. And fastened to one of the porch posts was a chain, heavy gauge, weathered, still locked to a metal ring screwed into the wood. It looked like the kind of thing you'd use to tether a large dog, but there was no dog, no bones, no dish, just the chain. And the wood under the ring was worn smooth, grooved from tension, like something had pulled at it for a long, long time. Eli nudged the chain with his boot. "Weird it's still here." That was the only thing he said. We didn't go inside. The cabin didn't look safe, and honestly, I didn't want to. The air smelled off around it, like wet earth and something faintly metallic like rust and rot. We climbed back up to the trail and didn't speak for a while. That night, we camped higher up on the ridge. We thought putting elevation between us and the hollow would help us sleep better. We were wrong. It was colder that night. The kind of cold that gets into your clothes before you even realize it. We tried to get a fire going, but the wood was damp. Mostly just steam and a little flicker of flame. Around 1 a.m., I was wide awake. Couldn't get warm. My sleeping bag was zipped to the neck, but I still felt exposed. I thought about the chain again, how it had looked almost recently disturbed despite the rust. That's when I heard it again. The dog, But this time the sound wasn't distant. It was closer. Below the ridge, maybe 50 yards out. One sharp bark, then silence, then two more. Closer again. Eli's voice came low from the other tent. "You hearing that?" "Yeah." The barks came again, but now it wasn't just barking. I could hear something else, a sound like pacing, leaves crunching, soft rustle, movement circling the camp, just out of view, a heavy rhythmic pad of footsteps in the wet leaves. It didn't run. It walked, deliberate. The barking stopped, but the movement didn't. Eli whispered, "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. I was frozen. For almost an hour it circled. Every few minutes it stopped, like it was listening. Then it would start again, always keeping its distance, always out of sight. I don't know if it was a dog. I don't know what it was. At some point near dawn, it stopped completely. The forest went dead quiet. We didn't sleep, just lay there waiting for full light. When we finally emerged, the fog was still thick. The fire was out. Everything was damp. We found no tracks, but that didn't surprise me. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, soft, absorbent. The kind of terrain that swallows evidence. Eli didn't want to talk about it. Neither did I. We packed up and left in silence. But right before we hit the trailhead, we passed an old sign nailed to a tree, weathered and cracked, barely legible, but one word was still visible: beware. We didn't speak until we got in the car. I looked back through the windshield one last time. The woods looked calm, peaceful even, nothing out of place. But that night back in my apartment, I dreamed I was back at that cabin, standing on the porch, listening to something pacing in the dark, and I could feel the chain, not on the post but in my hands, like I'd been the one to unhook it, and whatever it was remembered me.